Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 16, Part 2. The office space wasn't adequate for 4 grown men to be comfortably seated. Nevertheless, DCI James, Sergeant Maddox and CI Argyle managed to find a surface to rest on in DCI Munro's office. Munro sat in his own chair behind his desk, with Argyle facing him on the only other allocated chair. James had requisitioned a chair from the corridor, positioning himself next to Argyle, and Maddox rested in a semi-standing position on the window ledge. They were all scrutinising the photograph of the tattoo that Forbes had pointed out on Rick van der Molen's body. "It's less than inspiring, isn't it?" said Argyle. It was a rhetorical question, as nobody could possibly disagree. "You seem to favour the Trinity chain of thought, don't you, James? What do you think, Munro?" "I agree that it's definitely something to do with threes. The only tattoos that are preoccupied with the significance of threes that I've ever heard of are the triads in Hong Kong and China. There was a big crackdown in the 70s. The police force and the civil service were largely in the pocket of such gangs. Half of the force was in their pay. They were mainly associated with prostitution and drugs, but a good deal of bribery and black market dealings were also part of their stock in trade," said Munro. "Good grief, you're right," said Argyle. "We should be thinking of triads, not Trinity. There used to be, and most probably still is, a Chinese triad that specialised in the theft of art and antiquities. They'd lure young, vulnerable kids into their net and use them to transport stolen goods. Once you were a member, you never got out alive. They were branded with a tattoo on the soles of their feet. It was a more sophisticated affair than this design, but I seem to remember that the design was based around a triangular shape." While Argyle was explaining about the gang, Maddox was searching the internet and looking for an image on his phone. He handed it to Argyle, asking which one it might be. "I've never personally seen one, but I read of a few of these examples." Argyle pointed to some particular images. "Each group has a kanji set inside a triangle. I heard of the orchid being used as it represented perfection, harmony and elegance. This might be appropriate to the world of art, but their world was really a very different story. As ever, the bottom line was the fact that millions of pounds were at risk, and they'd pay any price to keep their assets, no matter how gruesome the outcome. Betrayal inevitably resulted in violent death. They made their example plain to see, so that everybody got the message to toe the line." "Our design seems quite a schoolboy rendition by comparison. Do you honestly think that it can be related? It hardly seems feasible," said James. "I agree that these look like simplified brush marks," said Munro, "but combine that with the fact that there are 3 of them forming a symbol, and a masterpiece has gone missing, and now we also have a violent murder on our hands. Don't forget that Rick was under suspicion himself. The incontrovertible facts point to this almost childish tattoo having sinister connotations. It may not be a Chinese triad, it could even be a sort of copycat attempt. But it's a convincing line of thought. I'd say we'd got a gang of one sort or another on our hands." "When you put it like that, it makes sense. But it sounds ludicrous nevertheless," said James. "It's the sort of thing you'd read about in a boy's adventure story." "It might sound like that at first, but I assure you that no mere boy would get past the first chapter," said Munro. Maddox had been plucking up courage to join in the discussion, and as his seniors paused to contemplate the seriousness of what they might be dealing with, he found the lull he'd been waiting for. "I know you've explained about a Chinese gang that specialises in art theft and murder, but we're not in China now. What does this mean for us specifically?" he asked. "We can only guess at the moment," said Munro. "However, even if it's a pale comparison, I think we've an unpleasant organisation on our hands. It's apparent that they are organised. It's the only explanation for how successful the theft or thefts have been. Now there is a murder, we have to take the prospect seriously. They obviously mean business. whether we think their tattoo is silly or not. The tattoo Rick had is old, maybe even decades old. That would put him in his student days. Perhaps he got lured in as a student. It's a time when he'd be ripe to join in daring escapades and elite organisations, especially if they offer you the prospect of position and power in a world that's notoriously difficult to get on in. I suspect he wouldn't have been made fully aware of the cost until it was too late, said James. Does this take the heat off Scott? Asked Maddox. I'm not so sure that it does, said Munro. He's ripe for the picking just now. He's vulnerable and idealistic. Maybe he's keen to make his own mark, more than mere spray paint on a wall. He's already been in trouble. He's the perfect candidate. He'd only be at the bottom of the food chain in the organisation now, but he's perfectly placed to be used like a pawn on a chessboard. He'd have to show his commitment and earn his right to enter with promises of reward and advancement. What better way than to give access to the gallery? And for what? A mere sketch. It's the action rather than the actual item, like a rite of passage or an initiation. It's just a token. That's the message here, I think. They could have stolen anything, so why stay at a mere trifle, said Argyle. But didn't you say that this often happened? Art has been stolen purely because it was the only thing they knew to take, said Maddox. Munro nodded. Yes, that's still a possibility. It's all supposition and theory. But we have to view matters in the light of all the information we have available and, on balance, I think we're looking at the gesture rather than the actual value of the item stolen. That, and the fact that murder is now in the equation. On the way back to Mossleigh, James and Maddox discussed the case. Do you honestly think that this triad theory is viable, sir? Asked Maddox. I don't know that it isn't viable, said James. As such, we have no alternative but to consider it as an option. It may not seem at home to our experience to date, but the theory withstands scrutiny and we'll have to pursue the enquiries. In the meantime, you need to delve back into the employment records of the academic art scene at the time just before and up to the time that the mag theft was discovered. Do you have anybody in mind? I'm not sure that I have any firm suspicions, but I've a funny feeling that when you come up with something, and I'm certain that you will, I'm sure I won't be surprised. It seems uncanny that Conrad Jefferson is in the art clique. He'd be just the type to find it flattering to belong to some elite group. He'd never get his own hands dirty, of course. Nevertheless, I have no doubt that he'd be quite at home to turning a blind eye to the less pleasant part of belonging to such a scene. So long as he gets to feel important and clever, he'd be involved somehow. Didn't Munro tell us that one of the motives for stealing or acquiring stolen art was to gain a sense of conferred power and culture? That'd be just like Jefferson. You really don't like him, do you, sir? Whatever gives you that impression? James laughed at the transparency of his feeling against Jefferson. I know he seems like a really nice guy, and I do like the veneer that he presents to the world. It's just that in this game you never do trust that first impression, at least not with types like Jefferson. He's too clever for his own good. People like Jefferson are never satisfied with what the world legitimately has to offer. He doesn't need money or possessions, but he does need a challenge, and he thrives on power and control. Running an architectural company and studying art in his spare time won't be enough. You mark my words. There's always more than meets the eye with men like Jefferson. And what about Scott? Ah, yes, Scott. He's the new kid on the block, and it's funny how things turn sour now that he's on the scene. I've been nice to young Scott until now, but I think it's time I gave him my full attention. I've let you talk to him so as not to spook the kid, but I think I'm guilty of shielding him for Drew's sake. I promised Baskerville that I'd be impartial, and it's true that I've not stinted on Drew, but I've let him affect my attention to his friend. Scott is just as likely to be motivated by the possibility of prestige and acceptance, even if it's in less exalted circle than Jefferson's. It's all relative. It's time to get down to business, continued James. My sister is hatching a plan, but she's keeping her cards close to her chest, and so we'll have to carry on in our own fashion. Let's see what tomorrow brings. Maddox pulled in at Mossleigh police station, where James had left his own car. After bidding James goodbye and then posting the keys into the police station letterbox, Maddox walked to Henrietta's and James drove home in his own car. Every case required a good measure of dull routine enquiry and a generous helping of luck. James knew that, if they just kept following their noses, in time they'd smell the scent of a lead. At present, there was no tangible scent, but his nose was definitely beginning to feel the first signs of a twitch. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.